So welcome everybody. Thanks for joining our session, which is going to be a very exciting summary and kind of look back at the Red Hood Houses Resilience project. We're going to do mainly a panel discussion, but before we're going to have a short presentation that Frank is going to give, giving an overview of the project so we're all on the same page, and then we'll jump to the discussion. So I'm going to pass it to Frank Cruz. Hi.
Hello everyone, good morning. One second here. Okay. Oh, yeah, that's fine. Okay, let me get out of the way here. Okay. First of all, I just wanted to say I'm happy to be here today this morning. I'm taking the place of Hana Kassam, who is the design principal here at KPF. We're at KPF, we did architects of record for the project, we designed the project. There you go, is that better? Okay.
We might need some help with that.
Okay. Yeah, let me just move out of the way of the camera here.
We might need some help with the slides.
So we have a short slide deck to show here. Yeah, do we have a mouse or something that we can use to control the screen?
Try now. No. I think it's like one slide. I think it's a different slide deck.
All the AI in the world, and we're getting that PowerPoint again. Hopefully we'll get to it at some point. But maybe for the sake of getting started, should just go ahead.
Carlos, it looked like there were two PowerPoint files. If they exit, it looks like there were two PowerPoint files.
Of the lower.
Frank, maybe we do introduction.
Yeah, we can introduce ourselves while we're playing.
Sure. Okay, yeah, so I think while we're waiting to do the technical difficulties issue here, so well, I think we'll just go down and introduce ourselves here. We have the design team and the client with us here. As I mentioned, my name is Francisco Cruz, standing in for Hana Kassam, who's a design principal at KPF. I'm the managing director at KPF, and I worked through this project for the last 10 years. This is very close to the work that was happening here. Pass it to Joy.
Sure. And is this working okay?
Yes.
Maybe I just need it closer to my mouth. Hi, I'm Joy Sinderbrand. I'm the Senior Vice President for Capital Programs at the New York City Housing Authority. I joined NYCHA in 2016 to manage the Superstorm Sandy recovery program, of which Red Hook was by far the largest project in the program.
Hi, good morning all. I'm Vincent Lee. I'm with Arup. I'm a principal at the firm. I lead our civil and water engineering team here in New York. And I've been involved since the start of the project, from when we were master planning some of the ideas all the way now through construction. Oh, no, that didn't go through. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Richard Roark, planner, landscape architect, partner with OLIN, and like the rest of the team, I've been on it since the beginning in 2015.
Okay. Cohen Pedersen Fox is the architect for the project overall. Sorry, we had a nice little slide deck here that we were going to speak to. Hopefully we can get that going soon so you guys can see some images with our discussion.
maybe we can start with the discussion
Sure.
a little bit.
Yes.
And I think that if we get to the slides, then great. Hopefully we will at some point. But so the slides were meant to be a brief introduction of the history of the project and the status of the project, so you get a sense of the images. So we're going to paint the picture to the best of our abilities here. I'm the only one who didn't introduce himself. I'm Carlos Cerezo, Director of Sustainability at KPF. And I'm here as a facilitator a little bit because, as opposed to all of these fine folks, I've only been tangentially involved in the project, but I think it's a very meaningful example of a very long-lived effort in resilience in the city that succeeded in some things, is working on others, and we're all getting to learn a lot from, right? So I wanted, already everybody mentioned a little bit who they are and what they did in the project. I wanted to start the discussion by understanding where this project comes from, right? So the Red Hook Resilience Project started after Sandy, after the storm, as part of the larger FEMA funding for recovery and kind of resilience in different projects in the city. Part of that went to NYCHA, and Joy has been working in the project since its beginning, right? So I will start with you, and I wanted to understand a little bit of that history, how new it was to get suddenly that very big investment focused on flood resilience, which maybe at the time wasn't as established as something that NYCHA used to do. And then how did you start the project? Like how did that sort of form into this specific intervention in Red Hook?
And thanks so much. I'm going to hold the mic to hopefully make this audible to everybody in the back. So the Superstorm Sandy Recovery Program was the largest investment, federal investment in public housing since its inception. NYCHA didn't get access to that funding until around December of 2015, and we're seeing those long time horizons for disaster recovery funding continue to this day, where we're still pursuing the IDA funding, for example. Of that $3.2 billion program, about $550 million was invested in Red Hook houses. So this is by far the largest project in the program, and it was by far the largest project that NYCHA had endeavored to complete essentially since the buildings were built. So I think what this gets to is kind of the how did we get to the design that we chose, and Resilience at NYCHA was a spear point in terms of retrofit of affordable housing buildings. What NYCHA was doing was ahead of where zoning and building code was at the time. Those agencies were still developing some of those changes, and were actually looking to us to guide some of that. And I'm happy to let you go to slideshow first, so that my words mean more, since people will have a picture with 1,000 words.
Wait, does that move forward? Oh. Can you try go into the next? Or can we try take it to the next? No?
Okay.
From there? No? Oh no.
I thought David was a genius.
A mad one. Okay.
Okay, well, I will keep going then and say that Red Hook Houses is made up of two developments, Red Hook East and Red Hook West, and altogether we're talking about 40 acres of property. This is quite a large expanse of property, and so when we were thinking about protecting Red Hook, we were focused on the real damage that happened to critical infrastructure during the storm. Almost all of the critical infrastructure for the developments were in basements, as they are in many buildings in New York City. There were 21 boilers spread across the site that were all completely flooded. Electricity was completely disrupted. And then the water rose to a level that really made it impossible to exit and enter the buildings during the storm. So a lot of the design influence, which you'll see when you see the pictures, was about preventing that from happening again and being very purposeful about making that passive protection, right? Recognizing that across 40 acres, deployables would be difficult, if not impossible, to
We got the first
handle. Okay. Slide one. Okay.
Okay, so I'll jump in here. So as Joy was alluding to, the Red Hook Houses property is located in a place that was really wetlands in Brooklyn, New York, and It was developed as part of an initiative from LaGuardia where, they wanted to transform the slums to something that's more affordable housing, light and fresh air for all. And so, the land is basically built on fill, but it's also low-lying, right? And so if you go to the next slide, the result of that is in a storm like Sandy back in 2012, this was kind of an unprecedented event here in New York, where we had flooding here that was widespread. And as Joy had mentioned, it put basically all of the buildings and everything underground for about a week. And then after that, power was out for approximately a month for all of the residents. So it was really difficult. It was a time of year where the fall was coming, cold weather was coming, people didn't have heat and hot water, really damaging effects. So, like we mentioned, is utility, whoops. Could we just try to keep it on one slide until I ask to advance? Thanks, okay. So utility damage, as we mentioned, temporary boilers were installed as soon as possible after the event. Building damage, as Joy had mentioned, all the basements were flooded, which housed all the critical equipment, which was common for that era of building. Public safety was in jeopardy. There's no way of, kind of managing, the neighborhood as a whole. And then damage to services, a variety of services, mold, things like that were, kind of becoming an issue. Next slide, please. Okay, I think you're going backwards. Okay. Well, here's oh, okay. All right, let's just keep moving forward. This is going to be fun. Okay, so next slide.
There's a video.
There's a video coming up.
We're struggling with the slides.
Okay, we keep going backwards.
All right.
There's only 5 slides. Is there a second PowerPoint?
I think that.
Okay, we can
Yeah,
maybe.
we can
okay.
use that. Can you go to the slide with the overall view of the site? Yeah. I just want to have it running.
Apologies for the technical difficulties here. Go ahead, Carlos.
Okay, well, I think that, for Hannah, can you guys try and open either, so the video is playing somewhere.
Yeah, the audio is playing, but not the video.
Can you share the PowerPoint by any chance? It's open there, it's like minimized. Oh God, okay. So you got a glimpse of the site. So you're gonna have to, so the big intervention, right, and the biggest challenge for the site was trying to upgrade infrastructure to a point that it would, in the future, in a similar event, both protect the residents and allow for kind of safe operation of electricity, power, and everything else. And the design solution for that you're not seeing, maybe you get to see it later, who knows, was a combination of infrastructure, landscape, and architecture measures where rather than intervening in the buildings, which, and Joy might elaborate on that later, but the way that FEMA funding works doesn't necessarily allow you to change the buildings if they have not been damaged during a weather event.
Here we go, we got it.
Oh, okay.
That sounds dangerous.
It doesn't seem like it's going to stop. The days after Sandy, it was beautiful, bright sun, and all I could see was just people feeling so struck and traumatized by what had just happened. The initial 8 days was tough, but the 9th and 10th day it got cold because it was in October. 9th day, that's Richard's day. I had to help the elderly go step by step, carrying up water, food, candles, and flashlights. You live on the 10th floor, and you're 70 years old. How you expect to get groceries up there? What Superstorm Sandy and the surge that came and devastated Red Hook demonstrated for us here was that communities, neighbors, were the first responders. Federal government finally responded after a long time and passed the bill that really brought funding to public housing. That's where we figured out we needed
Just go to the next slide.
1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot, 4 foot. Next thing I know, these cars are bobbing. When the water came in, thousands and thousands of gallons were just rolling down the stairs. And I even said to my sister on the phone, I said, we're in trouble. Everything's underwater. Cars are bobbing like apples in a pail. By the storm in a place, but there were a number of other issues that the site faced, sort of on an everyday basis. The Red Hook homes were both a place hit really hard by the storm, and a place that is really hit hard by the legacy of public housing and what it takes to maintain it, and the level of investment, and also the level of neglect. You're not just talking about floodwater. You're not just talking about power outage.
If you can go to just at least one of the pictures of the final product, and we can just talk over there. Okay, thank you. All right. Yeah.
Okay, so as long as you can keep this slide here. Okay, so here's a quick map of the site. So as we've been talking about, the way in which you help protect a community like this from another storm is we basically lift all the critical infrastructure up to above the design flood elevation, which is where it's anticipated that floodwaters will not raise that height. And so our strategy here was to create two. You see the red diagram buildings in both ends of the site. Those are our power plant buildings. That is what creates the hot water, the heat, and the power in terms of a backup, and we have full backup on this site. Those distribute to smaller buildings that you see in orange throughout the site, and these smaller buildings we call utility pods. But they're more than just utility pods. They act as a way of wayfinding around the site. They help develop identity for each of the little clusters of buildings, and they are all served by underground conduit that is protected from floodwater. And then these pods break down that power and hot water to a more domestic use, right, for homes and the residences. And then those are connected to the risers inside of the buildings and then feed the apartments so that everyone has their constant power, heat, and hot water. Another thing we did here was we raised the landscape between the buildings where the entrances are. We call those lily pads on the project. And that actually was an opportunity to create a safe space above the design flood elevation for residents to come out to, but also be used as programming when you're not in an emergency event. So we're trying to foster community here through the design and through the limited dollars we had from FEMA to help for the project. Anything else? I was like, so much here. I know we can go on for hours with this. But okay, all right. So I think that was the slideshow.
Yeah, if you go to the next, at least we can keep one of the pictures. Next.
Oh yeah, there we go. Okay.
There you go.
Yep.
All right. Yeah. We can speak over these and think in order to recover some of the time lost. So apologies again for the very chaotic beginning. We're gonna try to get back on track. So as you've seen, sort of, the project is a combination of infrastructure and landscape work, right? And that sort of tries to transform both the access, the safety, and the community spaces of the project, as well as provide, as Frank was saying, heat, power, and kind of during emergency events, sufficiency for the project. So Joey already talked a little bit about how it started, right, and where the funding came from. The other piece I wanted Joe to speak about a little bit is the engagement process, right? So this has been a almost 15-year long project. 12, not quite. Sorry. Okay.
We'll say
10 10-year project, which has involved a lot of voices, right? Not only those here regarding design and planning, the city, the residents, the local advocacy communities around the project, people that had been in the houses before and now maybe they're not anymore, people that have come in, I presume, throughout the project. So this was probably a big challenge from a stakeholder engagement perspective. So can you speak a little bit about how that was done and maybe how it has affected NYCHA work since?
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about that because this really was an unprecedented opportunity for NYCHA, not just because of the number of dollars that we had to invest in the site, even though those were limited in how we could spend them. It was the first time NYCHA really had the funding available to fully incorporate this kind of resident engagement that you're talking about. And I don't want to quibble about the length of time it has taken to do this project. This is a huge project. While NYCHA didn't have access to the money until December of 2015, we were already starting to think about design. We were trying to get ahead of that design curve. Once we had the finalized scope from from FEMA, what they approved their money to be spent on. Then we could engage with a design firm to really put pen to paper. And that's what you saw happening in 2016 and 2017. This project is extraordinarily large, and it is being done on fully occupied buildings at a fully occupied development where people live. That's their homes. And so we knew throughout the project that we were going to have to be very responsive to residents, and that meant not just the charretting you saw some of those pictures of behind me, but we had a full-time liaison, a Red Hook resident on the site for as much of the project as possible. We still have a full-time liaison on that site. NYCHA had website, email, hotline, translators, attended every TA meeting that we were invited to, family days, and every other event that we were asked to speak at in the neighborhood to make sure that people had access to the information. And actually, if you Google NYCHA Sandy now, somehow the Google algorithm works perfectly. You will get our website first, and you can find additional information about the Red Hook project there. The feedback loop, though, didn't end when construction started. So the milestone engagements with the residents were certainly helpful to incorporate into the design, and we also did a separate engagement with Kaboom on the playgrounds. It was also about getting feedback during construction on how to mitigate the impacts of construction. The conduit that you saw crossing the site there, the new 32 miles of electrical conduit, new heat and hot water distribution piping, that's very disruptive work. The annex buildings that that Frank talked about, those 16 buildings required pile driving, right? And we were really cognizant of how impactful that was going to be on residents, particularly after the start of COVID and having to be at home during the day when people needed to work and go to school. So that during construction engagement has actually been increasingly important. And as we've reached so the tail end of construction, we're still getting feedback from people about design elements that they saw maybe on paper or in renderings, but experiencing them firsthand, they still have feedback on how this is going to impact their lives, how the operations and maintenance staff are going to be impacted. And as much as possible, we are trying to still incorporate the feedback that we get from them. Just one more thing to say is that this has been really a benchmark. This was the first time NYCHA engaged in this level of kind of comprehensive engagement. It's now actually part of NYCHA's standard operating procedure. Certainly on the major projects you hear about, the comprehensive modernizations, the PACT projects, the trust projects, but even on our smaller projects, every single capital project now has a standard procedure for resident engagement, stakeholder engagement, and operations engagement, where we have a minimum of 10 to 15 touch points throughout the process. And that standardization in part stemmed from some of the benefits that we saw from this project that we wanted to include in every project, from replacing a roof to replacing elevators to something more comprehensive like a playground or a community center.
Great, thanks. There you go. And it's interesting, like you were saying when we were preparing for the session, that there is even, it's sort of created an expectation, right? That now in NYCHA projects, in other NYCHA projects, people expect the level of engagement that happened here, right? So it's sort of informed some of the process.
We don't quite have enough, we don't have enough resources at NYCHA to provide the same level of service as we did for a $500 million project, but the capital, so I'm in asset and capital management. The division has created its own stakeholders partnerships team. So this is a team that is available. Every single tenant association president has a liaison that they can reach out to for questions about any project on their site. So they don't have to navigate the 5 or 6 or 7 different projects on their site, figure out who this fence belongs to and which vendor and which project manager. And so the liaison is there to help on smaller issues like that, and then help them navigate on bigger issues. For example, if they are looking for a change in design in late stage, or making sure we have their approval before we proceed with construction.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to switch now to the more technical side of the project and ask a question to Vincent. So we heard on how the project started from a funding kind of a stakeholder perspective. The other incredibly important part of this is how the project started from a water perspective, right? And so obviously Sandy and the search and everything else is the starting point. But then when the project started, what is incredibly challenging to to maybe think about now when we are so used to talk about flooding and climate change in the city, and there's so many policy in place and so many frameworks, is that at the time there were not, right? So from an engineering perspective, when on the Arup side you had to even like quantify the problem, right? How likely it is for a new Sandy to happen? What is the impact of climate change in all of this? How do we even figure out what floodplain we need to design to for this kind of unknown condition? How did you tackle that, and how would that be different today, right, when there's much more groundwork done from that side?
Yeah. So I think when we started this in 2015, mind you, right, everything was in response to Sandy, right? So the reaction and sort of the design that resulted was all worked through with NYCHA, right? So we went through a pretty intense 6-month exercise of even just establishing what's the right design criteria to design for. I mean, now we have the climate resiliency design guidelines. There's a lot of guidance right now that's available to us that we use, and in some cases, much of that is even codified in that we're required to do so. I think, you know, when you look at resiliency projects around the city or even just anywhere else, retrofitting in cities is a challenge. But as Joy noted, people live here, right? So when you retrofit in public space, let's say a waterfront park, it's a challenge. But when you're retrofitting and trying to maintain a livable community throughout a duration of 8 or so years during construction, it is completely disruptive. So you have to be really sensitive to what the community needs are. So when we embarked on some of the options, the sort of reaction was, and this was sort of happening in the city, was there wasn't like a toolkit of solutions, right? There was a lot of dialogue around what's the right solution. Do we incorporate nature? Do we look at perimeter walls? Perimeter walls came up, and right off the bat, from community engagement, perimeter walls was not something that the residents wanted to see. They wanted to ensure that they still provided access through adjacent neighborhoods. They didn't want to be walled off. So that started to lead itself into other design solutions, which I think Richard can talk a lot about in terms of the lily pads. And if you really go through the engagement process and if you really study the site, you can't take this solution and take it onto other projects. The courtyards that are created here, those work because the front doors are all facing inward, and it worked with the lily pads and it worked with flood protection. The other thing we found through community engagement was, yes, we needed to elevate the landscape in certain parts to protect key aspects and key components of the buildings. But the thing we actually heard a lot from the residents was sort of like everyday rainfall, right? And we noticed now through Ida and through all the extreme storms that we're seeing just from rainfall. But even then, the residents were complaining about, like, every time it rains, there's like puddles all throughout the site. There's aging infrastructure. There's drains that were not functioning in the way that they were intended. So in addition to working through the flood solution, like the next Sandy, we also had to work through, like, how do we deal with those everyday flooding, and how do we incorporate it as part of the flood protection, as part of the public space that we were trying to also weave in right into the neighborhood fabric. So we literally sent people there when it was raining to sort of like identify like where standing water was. So that became part of the solution in itself. And then I think the other component to, in terms of like modeling and all of that, is that you can't necessarily model for or design everything for, let's say, the 100-year storm. You can't design everything to handle Ida. But what you can test for is what happens if Ida comes. We know our infrastructure is old. So if a major storm comes, where is water going to bubble up, across the site? And can we still protect all of the critical systems that we need to? Can we still make sure that that water is not going to bubble up into someone's front door or some other key component of the site that we don't want water to go to? So while we can't design, let's say, the underground systems to manage these big events, we can at least test what happens during these big events to protect the areas that we intend to.
Right. And so I think that is a nice transition to Richard's and OLIN's work, because so on the technical side and on the kind of the engineering side, there are these two big pieces. There's the elevation of the public spaces, and then there's elevation of infrastructure, right? And those can be very, like you were saying earlier, like when I see my construction photos, they're never like the pretty ones above the site. I'm seeing like pipes and wiring and stuff like that. I think that the really successful thing, or what I hope is going to be successful thing about this project, is that was covered by a very sensitive layer of understanding what the site needed to be and how those infrastructural pieces could do more than just contain water or provide electricity. So I think that's where Richard comes in. I'm curious, can you speak a little bit about how you made it so that, or the all-in work made it so that their infrastructure became something more other than infrastructure, and then how that captures or ties the identity and the history of Red Hook on the site.
Yes, and I think just like the opening to this presentation, staying humble is really important. You don't know what you don't know. And we're working in Red Hook, you're stepping into a lot of history. These houses were first built in the mid-1930s. Red Hook West was built in the 1950s. And so there's a lot of history. There's been generations here. And then when we came to this landscape that was, holding itself together through a lot of temporary measures. There was fencing everywhere, but there was also, even before Hurricane Sandy, there was a lot of fencing in the landscape. We did a survey of the 42 acres, and it has one of the highest proportions of open space in Brooklyn, but 74% of that open space was cut off because of management complexities, of trying to keep things maintained, because as Joy will tell you, NYCHA is always trying to work with the smallest of resources to deliver the most to the residents. So there was a big thought problem in terms of how do we make this open space something that helps people stay connected and be resilient every day, and how does it serve this function of keeping the waters out? And so we worked very hard to find that solution without the walls. And we thought a lot about actually how do people feel safer in terms of a sense of having a space that they know belongs to their community, belongs to their buildings. And what I think was interesting about the lily pads is that it not only like lifts the water out, but it was also thinking about, well, how do we also address the kind of retrofitted accessibility that all the NYCHA buildings had. So, like in the 90s, trying to, make the ADA Act really function for those buildings. There was a lot of ramps that were just tucked in beside stairs, and, they were kind of like cattle chutes. And, how could we make the entry into a building, feel like you're coming to your place and it's not like the back end of things? So having the opportunity to build in protection from climate risk for the community was also a way of trying to figure out how do we, get into these other issues that were impacting the resilience of the community in the everyday. And so this landscape, this place, is, serving thousands. I mean, that $500 million is a big number, but it's literally a project to serve thousands and thousands of people who have been waiting for change, waiting for the infrastructure to be upgraded and safe. And when we put those landscapes together with the lily pad scheme, it was a way of representing the buildings, giving people common areas that weren't just one big undifferentiated green that didn't feel like anybody's, but each territory began to feel like it belonged to a neighborhood of buildings. So there was a lot of trying to think about the sociology of space, trying to think about how people could watch their kids, in a area that was relatively defined, where you could say, don't run off here, or stay within the courtyard. Having that kind of organization is something that we really felt would serve the residents. But as these new elements have come, I think everybody's always asked at NYCHA is well, am I getting the same services that others are getting? How is this equivalent? How do you do that when you're trying to put a landscape together and listen to what people are saying? that was a constant learning curve for us, and the learning can't stop with us or stop with our moment, but in terms of like this kind of pivotal moment in design, thinking about how does resilience transform into something that serves community and residents, that was what was going on in our heads in terms of the lily pad landscape. Yeah.
And I don't know if we can go a couple of slides forward, or that would be a terrible idea. We'll see. But just so these images that you're seeing, these are as of last fall. So you see a lot of brown here, and now this is all planted and is all green. And there, I think a month ago, the new trees were coming in, so there was a big planting ceremony as well. Huh?
The first phase.
Right, the first phase of the new trees were coming in. And then, you can see here some of those pods that distribute the infrastructure. But then there are a number of initiatives from either the community itself or local advocacy groups where some of these spaces are starting to be owned by those that are going to use them, right? So there's this big mural art for where people from the community have worked on. There's an AR component to these. People can go to their phone to the mural and then learn information about the site. There have been fairs around it to kind of educate residents and local community on issues of climate change. This was the planting of the trees with the Attorney General not too long ago. So this is slowly becoming this sort of landscape community-owned place that Richard was talking about that started with like a very infrastructural proposition. So the last question I'm gonna ask the panel, because we don't have a lot of time left and I wanna have some time for questions. Right, so well, maybe we directly jump, I think, into questions with the audience, and then we can go from there. So I think we've covered what we could with a somewhat chaotic timeline that we had. I presume there might be a lot of questions about how the projects look and what things are, so we'll open it to the audience. Right.
I didn't hear you mention microgrids. Was that something, creating a microgrid, something you looked at, or?
You know, there were actually, there's a whole list of strategies that were looked at. When we were first starting this project, that $550 million number seemed so big. It seemed like we could embed, we looked at new elevators, we looked at a pneumatic waste system, we looked at microgrids, we looked at other technologies that we wanted to incorporate. And the fact was the FEMA funding was such that we had to deliver on the core scope of work, and that was our priority. And then everything kind of above and beyond that was secondary. And we actually couldn't, you know, the challenge of doing just the FEMA scope, and I wanted to sort of add to the list you said before, it was flood protection for all of the residential buildings, new roofs for all of the buildings, new entrances for all of the buildings. We've put in CCTV, layered access, new site lighting for the entire site, a new heat and hot water system to serve all buildings on the site. So there's 28 residential buildings and 2 community buildings, built a new senior center, renovated retail space. So there was a lot of scope in this project. And as time went on, that scope, some of that scope got more expensive because of existing conditions. And so we weren't able, we actually did an RFP to the market to see if there was a way to incorporate it at no additional cost, and it was a significant additional cost, and so we weren't able to do it. But the backup power that we're providing is actually full backup power. So NYCHA is across the portfolio. We'll have about 200 multifamily buildings with these full backup power generators, and where it works, we're enrolling those buildings in demand response. So we are still kind of protecting the surrounding neighborhood by making it possible to take buildings off the grid when there are those times of high use.
Hi, I'm curious if you could speak to some of the design strategies that were used for stormwater management in terms of diverting water, how it was stored on site and flowed out so that the site drained properly, and not just sit there in an extreme flood scenario.
Yeah, so earlier when I mentioned that we literally identified where like ponding happened on site. So there's two things we're trying to deal with flooding, right? There's the surge from Sandy, right, which is water coming in from the sea, and then there's the water that we deal with rainfall. So actually, one of the reasons why we ended up with, one of the reasons of many that we ended up with lily pads was if we ended up with perimeter walls, the issue always happens is, well, if you have a wall, you have a surge, and you have rainfall, you create this like bathtub, right, that's in there. So by actually having the elevated landscape, we're avoiding that issue and that challenge. But at the same time, we do want to deal with all of the rainfall flooding. So even in almost, I think it's almost every lily pad has stormwater storage as part of the buildup for it, but also as a way to obviously manage the rainfall through the additional impervious surfaces from the building. So that was incorporated there. And again, like there's the sort of like what you size based on what's required, which is what we did. And then there's the, okay, if it exceeds that requirement, where does that water go? And then there's sort of like a test to make sure that like it's going to where we want it to go and not going into places that we're trying to protect.
Over here, maybe first in the front and then over there. Yeah, go ahead.
Particularly Mr. Sinderbrand, is the project city, state, and or federal, or is it a combination of all three to rebuild?
The disaster recovery project is a FEMA-funded project. We were able to use HUD CDBG-DR as our local match. And there are some very small city discretionary grants that have been offered during the project, but really de minimis. There are other construction projects happening at the site. So while the great majority of the investment is through Sandy, since that time, NYCHA has received other funding for other projects like Local Law 11 and security projects, and those might be city or state, but they're not part of the disaster recovery resilience work.
So you can't rebuild until you get the federal money. Is that correct? Is that
Oh, well, let me just be clear. $550 million does not solve the problem. There's over $1 billion more of need at Red Hook houses. No, of physical need. So there's significant physical need. FEMA did not consider the interiors of the building to be damaged by Sandy. And so we were not able to do apartment work, interior renovation work, elevator replacement. That was not part of this project. So there's still considerable need there.
Over there? No, wait. Oh, sorry. Next.
Well, first I got to thank the team that's up here with me, because a lot of the work that they did is part of our kind of flood resilience and NYCHA best practices guide that's on our website, but that also we use internally. So the Sandy Recovery Program was 35 developments, so 200 buildings. We're also partnered with DEP at about 4 dozen more developments through their green infrastructure program. And then we're building through the community resilience design guidelines and the stormwater rule. We are building resilience and sustainability into our state of good repair as much as we can. So the notion that we're going to get these giant grants is, it's a hope, but it's not a way to plan ahead. So whenever we do a state of good repair project, we look at what we can build in. Wherever we do a project where we can kind of stack the capital somehow with a grant, we try to do that. And then, we really are, one of the things that's very exciting about this program, I joined NYCHA in 2016, but I also grew up down near Gravesend. So, this was new to New York. This was not people waving their fist at the sky because, they weren't going to leave kind of thing. This had never happened. And today, I go to the same developments and residents are advocating for the funding for these projects. It's not just us coming and saying, we got money, we're doing something. And so it's pretty exciting to work with residents to advocate for additional funding.
I
two very important questions. The first lesson of resident engagement is it's never enough. And I kind of joke about the way on the weekend sometimes I wind up on the platform, even though there's been like 4 signs before the platform telling me the subway's not running. I don't know how often you walk across the site, but in addition to the TA meetings, the tens of thousands of flyers, the hundreds of thousands of Rose Bowl calls, what we have up at Red Hook specifically are these vinyl signs across the site that talk about the specific scope of work behind a particular fence. So not just, hey, there's construction, but what are we building right here, and what percentage complete is it? And that sign will have a QR code, our website, our hotline. Every flyer we hand out for a service interruption, like a utility interruption, water, electricity, will also have that information. Troy Huntley, who is the liaison, lived at Red Hook for many years. Before her, Robert, who unfortunately passed away, also lived at Red Hook for many years. People are generally either involved with a tenant association or not. So we try to also show up to any other events that are happening on the site. If Red Hook Initiative or Family Day or any other pop-up community, the community will show up and table and try to be available and present. So we're trying to make sure that anyone who's interested can find out more. We will have that engagement through the end of this project, but like I said, this is not something that NYCHA is necessarily funded for in the long haul. So that tenant association on East and West will each have a property liaison to help them going forward with the other projects that happen at their site. It won't be a full-time person, they'll have to share that person, but we'll still provide the information as they request.
For 1 second, like to the second part of the question, which I think is an important one, and it's sort of like I'm have a question for the panel on that. So this is, as you said, this is like a small piece of Red Hook. Red Hook as a whole area is very exposed. There is also a lot of change happening in Red Hook right now. There's the whole BMT planning, the whole EDC waterfront reimagining, which includes proposals for water protection and kind of larger visioning of what needs to happen to protect Red Hook overall. So how much of that has influenced these projects, or not at all, right? Like, is there like any integration between the vision for the Red Hook houses and the larger vision for Red Hook? Or do you think there's anything that was learned in this project that they should be certainly looking at? And this is a question for anybody.
Yeah, no,
right?
and I'll just say we came first in the sense that NYCHA got access to its funding, developed a vision for the project, and developed a timeline for execution before some of these other projects had certainty. And so the goal was to make sure we protected the NYCHA residents with the funding, with the additional layers of protection being a great thing when and if they're finished. We're going to finish for our residents first. But you can talk about the calculations in terms of sea level rise and et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, I think as Joy said, I mean, this work happened prior to all of the other projects that are happening. There was a Red Hook flood resiliency study which had happened. I think the way that we approached this one was we need to ensure that the site is as resilient as we can make it to the guidelines and to the data that was available to us at that time. Project it as forward as we can. We know that these infrastructure and housing is going to be here for decades. But also, like, with the understanding that if those projects don't move forward, we have to make sure that like the residents are protected. And then anyone that works in resiliency, that like there's redundancy that needs to happen. So there's always that consideration. And then I think what should happen now is with these other projects that are happening, they should account for the fact that Red Hook is already been invested in terms of flood protection, so that as they work through, let's say, neighborhood strategies or other components, they can sort of weave that in and integrate it as part of their solution, right? So maybe they can sort of save some investment, knowing that there's already been a tremendous amount of investment for Red Hook houses.
There's another question somewhere in the back. I don't know if. Oh yeah.
You mentioned there were some design changes based on operations and tenant feedback. What were some of those?
The question was about the design changes based on resident feedback, and there were a number, so I'll let Frank give some, and if he misses an important one, I'll throw it in.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll do this one. Okay, yeah, thanks. That's a great question. with a project spanning a decade, and a pandemic on the front and back end of it, there are a number of things here that came out maybe more expensive than we all anticipated. A couple of examples. One I can say, working with the contractor on the construction systems for the buildings that we designed. We were able to maintain the design intent of these buildings through the change of systems that were more cost effective at certain points in time. So when the initial idea was to kind of prefabricate everything, bring it onto the site, and kind of erect it in place, that turned to be expensive at a moment. So we changed the system to accommodate, and we were still able to maintain the design. I know I'm missing a big one, so go for it.
That's a
It's
little less
detailed.
resident engagement. So the residents really had a lot of input on elements of the project that were less technical. Colors, placement of trees, types of plantings, playground shredding. We had feedback early on that the two major buildings on the project, the ones that you saw the images of, the east plant, which houses the high-pressure steam boilers and the full backup power for most of the site, and the west plant, which houses the backup power for the west side of the site. The residents thought those were too big. They were designed to be as small as possible, but they still felt too massive to the residents. And so actually, the team went back and found a way to make those buildings smaller and to really tighten things up so that they could be as small as possible. And they cut a significant amount. I think it was like 30% of the size of the west pod, maybe 20% off the height of the east pod. So that was a really significant change. And then one of the design changes that's happened after is there were a number of areas, I don't know if you could see it on the picture of the playground, where stone, what do you call those stone cuttings?
The boulders?
Boulders were used as part of seating and placemaking in the playgrounds, the way it is at many parks across New York City today. And the number of boulders that were intended, residents thought were too many. And so we worked out a way to reduce that number and to also literally shave the edges of the boulders so they felt less sharp to parents who were concerned about kids getting hurt.
I just want to add one more thing. So the Joy had mentioned the reduction of the plant sizes, which is absolutely true, and we worked really hard to do that. But just adding kind of value to that idea, looking at the West Pod and the mural that we were able to kind of create with the help of the community, as you saw in the photos above, really engaging the community in that process. It faces Coffee Park, and it's a really great attribute, I think, to the community. So, we were able to not just cut costs, but also add value while doing that.
Yeah, and that was a great partnership with the Public Housing Community Fund. If anybody's interested in partnering and contributing to NYCHA, the Public Housing Community Fund is our nonprofit arm, and they worked with Snapchat and Artolution to get that mural done and to train teens on the site in programming.
Yeah. Just to pick up on some of those changes is, it's not a monolithic community. There's many different people and needs. The seniors are a strong voice, and then the youth, in terms of like wanting to play, active sports and basketball. We thought we'd put something in the right place, and they'd be like, no, this is right where the seniors are gathering. It's not going to work. Like that level of kind of intelligence about knowing how to design the space and do it right, it only comes from that kind of feedback.
Right, well, I think we are out of time. So thank you for staying. Thank you for bearing with us in our somewhat rocky start. And thank you to all the panelists who shared that.